Two of the main themes underlying the Dreamweaver Creative Cloud update are support for HTML5 and simplifying the workflow by concentrating options wherever possible in the Property Inspector. In the case of forms, this affects the workflow in both positive and not quite so positive ways. On the positive side, the Forms category of the Insert panel and of the Insert menu now has options for several HTML5 input types: email, URL, tell, and search. There's also a separate option for password. In the past, you needed to insert an ordinary text input field and then change the type to password in the Property Inspector. There are other positive changes, but before I can show you them, I need to create a form and insert some elements, and in the process you'll see what I regard as the less positive aspect of the changes. So let's save this page. I'll call it Form and give it a title, simply Form, and then make sure that the focus is in Design View. Dreamweaver behaves differently depending on whether the focus is in Design View or Code View when you're working with form elements, and it's usually much easier to work with the focus in Design View. So let's first insert a form element. That works exactly the same as before, but down here in the Property Inspector we've got some new options. These are HTML5 specific, No Validate and Autocomplete. There's also an option here on the right hand side for changing the character set which is accepted by the form. Next, I'm going to insert a text input field. So select text here in the Insert panel and just click that. And what has happened is that Dreamweaver has immediately inserted an input element into the page. In previous versions of Dreamweaver, you were presented with the Input Tag Accessibility Attributes dialog box, which prompted you for an ID and a label, and Dreamweaver didn't insert the input element until you'd provided that information. Now you have to set the name and ID down in the Property Inspector here in the Name field, so I'll change that to First Name. And you can see that the name and ID attributes have both changed now to first name. But without a label, form input elements aren't much use, and to insert the label you need to go to the bottom of the Insert panel. There it is, Label. The input element is still selected, so if I click Label, it appears as though nothing happens, but if you look in Code View you can see that the input element has been surrounded by label tags. And if I click to the left-hand side of my input element, I can then type First Name as my label. This works, but accessibility experts don't recommend wrapping input elements in labels. What is recommended is to put the label separately and to use the For attribute and point to the ID. So I'm going to go back and delete that, and I'll select Label down here in the Tag selector, right click and choose Remove Tag, and that has removed the label, and I've now still got the input field selected. So what I'm going to do is to press my left arrow once to deselect it and put the insertion point to the left of the input element. Now I'm going to click Label here in the Insert panel, and that has put the label in there, and it's put the focus into Code View. So I can now type First Name there. Then I need to go into the label tag itself, press space to bring up the code hints and to create a space, and it's the For attribute that I want. And the For attribute has to be the same as the ID, so I need to type First Name. And if I put the focus back into Design View, you can see that we've got the label and the input element in the correct place. So let me just select the input element again. Now a useful thing to know is that if you change the name in the field down here and you've got a For attribute in the label, Dreamweaver will keep the two in coordination. So if I change that just to name and press Tab, you'll see that the For attribute has changed to name. It now matches the new ID here. So that's quite useful, but I think that you'll probably agree that the workflow of having to put the label in separately is far from ideal. I understand that Adobe is reconsidering this workflow for the next update, but it's something you'll need to get used to for the time being. Now, on a more positive note, let's take a look at the options in the Property Inspector. They've been updated to take account of new features in HTML5. Disabled and read-only were there before, but new ones that have been added are Autofocus, Required, and Autocomplete. There's also an option here to set the form. HTML5 allows you to use form elements outside of a form and associate them with a form elsewhere in the page, and this is where you set that option. Pattern is for a regular expression that validates user input, and there are also options for placeholder and the list attributes. Modern browsers have already started supporting these HTML5 features, so having them easily available in the Property Inspector is an important step forward. Now, one thing which you might notice about the Forms category of the Insert panel is that it no longer has the Spry validation widgets. If you still want to use them, they're still there in the Spry category. And you can find them here, the validation text field, text area, and so on. Now, I mentioned earlier that Dreamweaver behaves differently depending on whether the focus is in Code View or in Design View when you insert an input element. So let's go back to the Forms category. And I'll put my insertion point just before the closing form tag, and I'll insert another text element. So I'll click Text here, and it's put in simply input type equals text. There's no name, there's no ID. Of course, you can add the name and ID manually, but if you prefer working with the Property Inspector, it's better to have the focus in Design View when inserting form elements. So that's an overview of the changes to the workflow when creating an HTML form in the 12.1 update. The Insert panel and the Property Inspector have greatly improved support for HTML5 form elements and attributes. The downside is that you need to add form labels manually.